I am not directing any of my criticism toward the bill's sponsor, who I think is a fine legislator. But in case you missed my talk, I hate OCA. Thank you.
I've also declared war on potholes, so here's the first shot across the bow.
Well, as you know, with Planet Albany, there's always something that makes the planet turn.
And it's this amazing view of D.C., and Eddie Vedder comes out, and he goes, "You have a cigarette?" And I've never smoked in my life, but if I had, I wish that was the moment.
And this strategy takes us from potholes to knotholes.
I would like to say it was a pleasure, Mr. Kim. But I'm on the road.
I'm David Lombardo, and you're listening to Dispatches from Planet Albany, a WCNY podcast about power and politics in state government. This week in Albany, we got Governor Kathy Hochul's fourth State of the State address, which, unlike her first three speeches, was held at the Egg and included more pomp and circumstance to the point where it wouldn't have actually surprised anyone if the governor had emerged from the floor to give her speech that lasted for nearly an hour. To reflect on what we heard and where things could go from here at the Capitol, we're joined in the studio by Dan Clark, author of the Capitol Confidential newsletter for the Times-Union, which you can find at capitolconfidential.com. Welcome to the podcast, Dan.
I am so happy to be here. It was like a whole Broadway musical before her address. Probably directed more towards me specifically in my taste, but I don't know if everybody else liked it.
Well, I am curious about your experience for State of the State Day, because people can have different experiences, although if you're a lobbyist, that didn't include actually being in the room this year. They were relegated to the overflow space. What was your State of the State Day like?
It felt more, exactly like you said, like way more pomp and circumstance. Way more big of a deal than the past couple of years when she's done it in the State Assembly chamber.
Yeah.
Like, security was everywhere down in the concourse. I think even like tighter than when Cuomo was governor, and it was pretty tight when he was governor too. It was fun in the sense that all of the people that we don't usually see but we talk about constantly were there. So it's interesting when like you have the mayor of New York City and the county executives and all these other stakeholders in the same room,
right,
listening to the person that they talk about constantly. And then, of course, afterwards you ask them about it and they have nothing to say, but that's fine.
What was the reception for the speech like in the room?
I mean, it depends on what side of the aisle you were on, but pretty positive.
Yeah.
I noticed that a lot of the legislature did not clap at a lot of the parts, even the positive parts for their respective parties.
Right.
So I think they were kind of just a little bit bored of the whole thing by the time that we got to the governor, which was, I think, like a full hour.
It was 46 minutes. I know this because I was doing the live coverage for New York Now, and we just had to keep filling time. Chantel Smith and I and Ian Pickus just had to keep going and going and going.
I know. I was actually thinking about you while I was in the room.
Thank you.
Watching the dancers and the singers and the poets and everything else. And I thought, oh my God, did they start at noon? Because, or 1 o'clock?
We went live at 1. We did cut to the New York Liberty torches at least once because Chantel kept getting distracted by the video of them. So we just
dancers?
Yes.
Best part. They were the best part.
Yeah.
Oh my God. How? We should do that every year. And in fact, what I said to the governor's people today is I said, when she announces the budget deal in April, I want them back to do like a little pre-announcement dance.
What was the logistics of the day like for you? Because I was able to hop into the spin room before the speech and then hop out. But talking to one of your colleagues at the Times-Union, they kind of made the analogy to being like cattle as you were shoved from one space to another. And from that point of view, that can be kind of a long day if you were there relatively early.
Yeah, I got to the spin room at right up close to 11, which is when the spin room was kind of opening for us as reporters.
Began spinning.
Exactly. And when you get in there, once you reach a certain threshold, you can't go back unless you don't want to come back. So by noon, I believe, the press was shut off from entering the Egg. So got to the spin room, spun around for about an hour, talking to people about nothing, basically. Went to the Egg and waited for the speech. And then there we were. It wasn't too bad logistically, honestly. the spin room was a little strange because it was a mix of people. You know, it was like the agency commissioners and then like the leader of this nonprofit. And of course, I don't know necessarily how much input they had on these things and how much they actually know about her proposals. So it was a mixed bag.
This seemed like something new in the Hochul era, this idea of having surrogates ready to go to talk about things. And from a communications perspective, depending on how it goes, it seems like it can be very effective for a governor whose messaging sometimes can be all over the place.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that was the purpose of it, is just to provide a few extra voices for people, especially so that we didn't have to hunt them down after the fact. Not that, after a State of the State, I don't think a lot of reporters go for the agency commissioners necessarily because that they are represented by the governor giving her address. We're looking for the lawmakers more so. But to have that space where we could talk to the commissioners was really helpful. We got the State of the State book embargoed before we got to the spin room. But it was a little difficult because we only got it an hour before. And I don't know about you, but I can't read 140 pages in 1 hour. I can barely read 10 pages in an hour. I'm a very slow reader. So that was a little difficult to hone in on, like, what were the important things that I should be asking about. And I came away with a few things, but I wish that I had more time.
So what about the speech itself? It seemed very uniquely Kathy Hochul in the anecdotes that she was telling and the rhetoric of the speech, especially with this fighter narrative and hearing the Wayne Gretzky quote for the umpteenth time from her. I mean, is it fair to say this was Kathy Hochul being Kathy Hochul?
It was Kathy Hochul at like prime Kathy Hochul.
Turned up to 11.
Yes, exactly. If you go back and look at in 2021, when she gave her first remarks and speeches, when she was both announcing that she was going to become governor and then became governor, the change from the way that she speaks publicly then to now is so different. And that contrast, you could really tell yesterday it was there. She wanted to bring her A game. And I think that she knew there was a lot of pressure yesterday because she has potential primary challengers already coming out of the woodwork. Mike Lawler will run for governor at some point, apparently. We don't really know yet.
Mike Lawler, who was here at the Capitol.
Yeah, exactly. He was here at the Capitol for a little pre-State of the State rally with Republicans. I think that she knew that she had a lot on the line. And I think for members of the legislature, at least, she delivered on a lot of the things that she was going for in terms of, getting them amped up for the session.
Well, looking ahead to the session, or probably the budget negotiations more specifically, was there anything that seemed like it will be a real problem for her to walk away from budget negotiation with in some form or fashion? Because for some context, since 2022, she's been very successful in getting things through the budget process that she wants, with the lone exception, and a notable one probably being her first take at new housing.
There are a few things that it's kind of like you can't unring a bell with some of these announcements, right? She announced middle-class tax cuts. We don't know how much these cuts will be per rate. It's supposed to generate $1 billion over 2 years. Not generate, but save taxpayers $1 billion over 2 years. That's something that if she goes into the negotiating room and comes out and says, never mind, like that doesn't look good for her.
I think she'll get the tax cut.
Oh, no, I think that she will too. But those are the kind of things that when you put them out there, you can't put the cat back in the bag.
But were there any things, maybe the involuntary commitments language that she's beginning to flesh out, as you noted in your newsletter, with some real details, or something else that she champions that you think will be a problem during the budget?
Yeah, I would say involuntary commitment for sure. And not necessarily, I don't know if I'd frame it as a problem, but the MTA revenue issue is paramount. I mean, they have to find $2 billion somewhere. They're not going to find it in the couch cushions. This is not like, a thing where we can pull funding from somewhere to put it in there. It's a lot of money, and they're going to have to negotiate something. I mean, I just asked the governor today if she's going to have a proposal in her executive budget to raise that revenue, and she said no.
Which seems to me, based on everything else they're proposing, whether it's the refund check or the expansion of the child tax credit, that they know over in the Hochul administration and in the Division of Budget more specifically, that they're going to have a shit ton of money
Yeah.
for this coming fiscal year. That receipts, either on the income tax side or the sales tax side, are going gangbusters, and they don't have to gear up for a fight over either spending or revenue raisers.
That's exactly it. I mean, we did this little dance last year too, I think, in that there was a budget gap, and then suddenly we had more revenue than we knew what to do with. You know, the revenue projections very much changed. So that budget gap was like not even an issue. I'm curious to see how much that gap closes this time. And we don't necessarily know what the needs are on top of what they are already projecting to spend. Like, if you're losing $1 billion because you're doing these tax cuts for the middle class, you have to generate that $1 billion somewhere else, or you have to say, I'm going to cut something in the budget. So there are a lot of unanswered questions of how do we plug these holes that we're creating, and how do we plug the holes that were already there? And it's a lot of spending without saying, this is how we're going to get the money.
Yeah. Well, before we move on, I want to recognize our underwriter for this episode, New York State United Teachers. So we mentioned briefly the effort to expand involuntary commitment in New York, and you noted in your newsletter that this is one of the few areas where we did get some additional details fleshed out as part of the speech, and obviously we'll get a lot more when the budget text comes out next week. But any part of that involuntary commitment push that was maybe listed in the policy book that you think is particularly interesting?
Well, right now, the involuntary commitment standard is they can involuntarily commit somebody who could be at risk of harming themselves or others. She and the mayor of New York City want to expand it to if somebody can't meet their basic needs, including food, shelter. So you could argue that every person on the street who is homeless would fall under that category, and that they could potentially take that person and commit them to the hospital if they have signs of a mental illness. But then it becomes, how do you define those things? How do you say this person cannot meet their basic need of food? If that person says, I'm not hungry, I'm fine, but you think that they're hungry, like, what does it matter? And I think it brings up a lot of, as lawmakers have said, questions over civil rights. Like, where is that line where you take somebody and commit them to the hospital, and where is that line where you allow them to stay in the subway, kind of like just sitting there and hanging out? Because at the end of the day, this is one of those issues where some people are looking at it from the lens of quality of life, right? Like, they want to go into the subway and not see anybody except other riders.
Right.
Then there are other people who understand that people don't have homes in New York City and would like somewhere warm to hang out in the winter, and they just are worried about people who are violent in the subways. But even then, like, it's such a tricky situation because mental illness does not equal violence. Not every mentally ill person is violent.
Yeah, and advocates will say that the people who are mentally ill are more likely to become victims of a crime.
Right, exactly. I am violently mentally ill, but I am not violent.
Well, I keep you at a safe distance for this recording.
Yeah.
I mean, I assume you can't just jump right over this desk.
Well, that's a fair assumption.
Anywho, when I think about the speech itself, when the governor initially brought up this idea, the room was very silent, and then we got some, light clapping and some recognition when she talked more about the services side of things, because that is where the focus seems to be. When I think about how this could end up, I rewind back to some of the previous efforts in the criminal justice space for this governor, who might not necessarily end up with exactly what she is pitching on day one, but is able to get something so that at the end of the day, she can claim victory. And I wouldn't be surprised if come mid-April, whenever this is wrapped up, we have a similar situation like that.
No, exactly. And what she really needs to do is not so much solve the safety issue, she needs to solve the perception of the safety issue. If she can do something in this budget, or any time throughout the legislative session, that makes people feel safer, she's done her goal. Because from the perspective of a lot of Democrats, subway safety isn't really a huge issue. These are isolated incidents that make big headlines. The woman who was burned alive on the train, that's going to be in the news. Like, that's not something that we're going to ignore. But then if you're somebody in Brooklyn who goes to Manhattan for work every day and you see that story, you might think twice about getting on the subway, even though the chances of you being attacked are infinitely small.
Are you surprised at all, sticking with public safety and the subway, that both Assembly Speaker Carl Hastie and Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins did not seem to balk at the idea of having police on trains at night, something that I thought might have gotten a reflexive pushback from two leaders who, generally are not embracing the police and the idea that more police make people safer?
Yeah, and I think one of them at some point has actually said almost that exact quote, is more police don't necessarily mean better safety. And it depends. I wasn't really surprised to hear them not say anything negative about it, only because I think that there is a big sense in their party right now, and for the past few years, that they have to move away from the anti-police rhetoric if they want to win these middle-of-the-road voters, especially if I'm somebody in New York City who is concerned about my public safety. If I hear a legislative leader saying, let's take cops out of the subway or something like that, I'm not going to feel great about that, I would assume. So I think they also have to balance it with members who represent Buffalo or Syracuse or
Rochester.
somewhere. Yeah, exactly. The solution for public safety in those cities is not going to be the same solution as
Because
New
they
York
don't have
City.
subways.
Well, yeah, that's a very good point.
I see what you did there. I made that connection. Well, I guess Buffalo has a train system of some sort.
Right. And I think a lot of the members, particularly in Manhattan, who deal with this issue very regularly, have been on the side of, police presence helps. It doesn't hurt. It doesn't solve the problem, but it doesn't make it any worse.
So in the aftermath of the speech, as my inbox was getting inundated with reactions, I don't know about yours, and the ones that I wasn't automatically deleting, one of the ones that I definitely read and it stood out to me was from the New York League of Conservation Voters, where their president, Julie Tai, responded to an item in the policy book, which basically said that the state is not going to be putting out a cap and invest plan anytime soon. He said, in the coming months we'll have something. And the quote from Julie was, failing to advance her promised cap and invest program in her State of the State, which can hold polluters accountable and protect public health, is government mismanagement at its worst. To me, that is really fiery language, especially from a group that I think of as more middle of the road on the environment, both in terms of policy and rhetoric. But given that backdrop, do you think that's actually going to be an issue where the legislature is going to rise up and say, no, Governor Hochul, you are statutorily mandated to get the ball rolling on this? Because we had Senate Majority Leader Stewart-Cousins on the show this week. I asked her about this. She acknowledged it's in state law, but wasn't necessarily clamoring for this program. So do you think the governor's push, or lack of a push, I guess I should say, on cap and invest is going to be what dominates here?
The environmental issues are so mixed, right? First of all, environmentalists yesterday, I got so many emails from them basically saying, like, what the fuck? We didn't know that this was coming.
You got your F-bomb in there.
Oh, I got my F-bomb in there. So they're very upset about this. But at the same time, here's the thing. Cap and invest raises costs for fossil fuel companies, obviously. Critics of cap and invest and other similar programs will say, hey, this is going to make fuel prices higher. This is going to make energy prices higher. At a time when Democrats are using the word affordability in every other sentence, basically, they don't even want that perception out there in something like this. So I think it's like they don't have a way to solve the climate costs, but at the same time, they don't want to do something that may make people believe that they're going to be worse than they are, even if that is not the case.
Yeah, because there is a rebate aspect to this, but I think the perception, just like you're talking about with regards to subway safety, it's the perception of the issue that really matters.
No, that's exactly it. And if there's enough pressure, I could see her going back on that and speeding it back up. but I don't know if there will be that pressure from the legislature necessarily.
So we often think about the budget as a process of give and take, but I kind of think about it in terms of the governor setting the floor on a lot of issues. For example, whatever she proposes on school aid is going to be the floor, not the middle point, not the end point. Same for, say, the child tax credit proposal or her middle class tax break. Are there any of the issues that the governor laid out that you think the legislature is going to be particularly interested in running with and dramatically expanding?
I would not be surprised to see them take her proposal for free community college for in-demand careers and maybe expand that. I mean, the State of the State book wasn't super specific on all of the careers that would be carved into that. Nursing is part of it. Engineering would be part of it. But I could see them maybe wanting to go further with that issue for sure. There is a pretty robust, and I don't know the details, but there's a pretty robust package in there geared towards sexual assault, preventing and helping victims. I could see them doing more there too. A few lawmakers have been really active on that issue in the past few years. Aside from that, the thing about the State of the State is there is not one overarching big thing that she's pushing, at least from my perspective. Like, as I was thinking about what to lead the newsletter with yesterday, I didn't really have one thing that I was like, this is going to happen. You know, one year Cuomo had the $15 minimum wage. Paid family leave was big. There were all of these things. And part of the challenge for Hochul is that Cuomo did a lot of the things that she might have wanted to do if she were governor. So she has a shorter list necessarily of big landmark achievements to work with. And I think there's also another side of it where all of the legislature, the Democrats at least, and Hochul are waiting for Trump to get into office and see what he does so they can start basically pushing back on that as they did from 2017 to 2020. It was pretty much all anti-Trump during that time.
Yeah, it seems like having Donald Trump as a foil, if you're the Democrats, is really, really useful. I remember writing stories about the third term for Andrew Cuomo, and people were saying, what is he going to do to avoid the third term blahs? And they're like, focus on Donald Trump. That's the best way to reinvigorate your campaign, reinvigorate your office. And if I'm Kathy Hochul, I'm probably praying, from a political perspective at least, that Donald Trump is very aggressive on the immigration side of things, tax side of things, or something that I can't even think of as we speak on January 15th, because it creates a foil, especially if he goes beyond what, say, those suburban voters will swallow. Is that safe to consume?
Yeah, I think so. But I don't know necessarily, because every county in New York, every single county except Yates County, moved to the right in this election. More people voted for Trump this year than 2020.
Yeah.
So you see her kind of leaning into these Republican ideas. Some of her proposals are literally like straight out of the Assembly Republican Conference.
As they are quick to point out.
Yes, as they are quick to point out. So I don't know necessarily how much she wants to push back on him right now.
Yeah.
I think maybe after she maybe wins in 2026, she could go on offense much more ambitiously. But I think for the time being, she kind of has to work with what she's got. And if she can go to him and make something like big happen for New York State, where they work together, I think that could actually be really politically advantageous for her. For example, if she's able to secure a bunch of federal funding for the MTA, that solves the state's funding problems while giving both Trump and Hochul a win. I mean, we are the center of the financial industry of the world. We're the financial capital of the world. Donald Trump recognizes that, so does Kathy Hochul. There are a lot of ways that they could work together where they could both benefit, I think.
And coming back to the messaging side of things, I'm particularly interested in the consumer-directed personal assistance program, because this is not something that I think the governor talked about in her State of the State. Maybe?
No.
Okay,
no.
great.
Nobody's talking about this except me.
Well, that's why I want to talk about it a little bit, because you have been someone who's leading on this issue. And for years, as we've been talking about this, the providers, the clients of this have been really dominating the conversation. it seems like there is a conscious effort by the governor's administration to push back on this issue to the point where they've got some advertisements dealing with quote-unquote lies about this issue. They have a communications person who seems solely dedicated to this issue, Sam
literally, yeah.
something, okay, and he seems intent on ruffling feathers in a way that maybe the comms people weren't in the past. How are you perceiving this push, and does it seem unique for the Hochul administration?
I think that they recognize that there is some opposition to it, but I think that opposition, for one, we're talking about a small share of the state, right? 250,000 people use this program. Not a small number of people, but most people don't know what CDPAP is.
No.
So when you have these ads out there airing on TV, like during Jeopardy, most people are probably pressing mute. Like,
Are you watching Jeopardy and seeing these ads?
I do watch Jeopardy, but I have not seen the ads.
Because you fast forward through the ads?
No, I watch it live.
Okay.
I pay for television, unfortunately. It's very expensive.
You're secretly a 70-year-old man. I gotcha.
It's not a secret.
Okay.
But CDPAP is so like niche, but there's so much money in it is the thing. You have these fiscal intermediaries, over 600 of them, and they all take a cut of this Medicaid money. So they're all profiting off of that. That's the nature of their business. That's capitalism. That's literally this country. Like, you can't knock somebody for doing that. And the Hochul administration is basically saying, we don't want you to profit off that anymore. We're going to give it to this big company, and they're going to profit off of it less, but, everybody will be fine. And the advocates are like, no, it won't be fine. And the thing is, like, nobody in this discussion is being completely transparent.
I'm shocked, Daniel.
I know.
You're saying in politics people haven't been intellectually honest about an issue?
Yeah, no, exactly.
Wow.
And there's
I have to rethink how I approach a lot of these people now.
There's this emerging narrative that I've been looking into for the past couple of months, and I won't get too deep into it, but there's this conflict of interest portion of it where the parent company of the contract winner for CDPAP is deeply, deeply, deeply enmeshed in the State Department of Health, like have so many contracts, and also with the State Education Department. So now the advocates are raising the question of, hey, why is this company so involved in state government? And why are you giving its subsidiary one of these contracts? So I think that's probably more the direction the advocates are going to go with their opposition from now on, because I think that they recognize saying this isn't going to save money is not going to work.
And it is bipartisan opposition, though, because there have been Democrats and Republicans. Although when we spoke with Assembly Health Committee Chair Amy Paulin earlier this year about her 2025 priorities and whether she was going to be joining her Senate counterpart, Gustavo Rivera, in trying to push this back, she basically shrugged and said, this is kind of a done deal. Best case scenario, you push the implementation back because they're not likely to be ready by April 1, and I needled that spokesperson about the April 1 deadline when I saw them on Tuesday. But yeah, it's hard to imagine the legislature standing up on this issue at the end of the day, because it's one of those areas where the governor seems to really care about it.
Well, also, they agreed to it.
Yeah.
This was a three-way deal in the budget last year. And here's the thing. When the budget was being negotiated, the name of this company, Public Partnerships, was already out there. They were not the presumed winner of the contract necessarily, but what I'm assuming happened, and this, did not happen, I don't know, I have no idea, is they were talking about this, and maybe somebody said, oh, Public Partnerships does that kind of stuff, maybe we could engage with them, and then they had an RFP and all of that. That being said, they agreed to this in the budget with the governor. They didn't say, we're not going to vote for this thing. They voted for it.
Yeah.
So they knew what was going to happen. They agreed to the single fiscal intermediary in this program. They voted for it. And to have them now come out and say, never mind, it's confusing for a lot of people. I mean, for the governor, she's probably thinking, did we imagine that entire negotiation last year? So I don't know if the majority of both majority conferences want to take that on, or if it's just a small number of people.
Well, especially because the other subplot on this issue, something that Bill Hammond of the Empire Center has highlighted, is this idea that the union SEIU is very interested in unionizing this workforce, and SEIU is very powerful within the majorities in the legislature. So I think if they're on board with this, I think that might dampen some of the opposition that lawmakers are actually going to put up behind the scenes, despite what they might say to the press and to the advocates in the space. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. We've been speaking with Dan Clark. He's the author and brains behind the Capital Confidential newsletter for the Times-Union, which you can find at capitalconfidential.com, and it is a bargain at whatever price they're offering these days. Dan, thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you. We're offering 30 days free right now.
30 days free right now, and then you got to pay.
Mr. Goodell.
Oh, I feel so much better getting that off my chest. Although I should have been much more discreet since I'm going back into private practice. But